It could, but the other thing you have to remember is Ireland, in the current situation, really has two choices that I can see. They can either continue to ally themselves with the EU and essentially be subsumed into this big federalist state that they seem to be bent on trying to create, or they could take the other really political. That's not, people don't really want that, but equally people have this sort of visceral reaction to doing anything with the UK. But really, their only other option at the moment, with the world having not completely disintegrated, but being the way it is, would be for an economic, not a political, but an economic alliance with the UK, which they kind of used to have and did when we moved here. The punt was even called the pound unofficially. Everybody called it the pound, even though it was the punt. And a lot of Irish law is the same as English law, and a lot of, even though there's very much a that's them and this is us, there was an awful lot of unofficial alliances there. Now, whether, and again, it may be that people explode simply because they can't deal with two unpalatable choices. Now, that wouldn't surprise me either, because there may be like, well, why do we have to go with the EU or England? We'd hate both of those options, so we're gonna blow up. That could be it too.
Okay. Well, thanks.
Just don't know. I'm sorry.
No, I think that's fine. I think it's just we're discussing something that, how can we know? Global revolution. I mean, how would that play out? I mean, who knows? I mean, maybe Canada would be important in this. I mean, it's hard to imagine, but it could be.
Could be.
I keep waiting for the Japanese since I live in Japan, but I think like the Irish, I think they're just going to blow up at some point.
Yeah, and I think that's a good. The Japanese and the Irish are very, very different, but I think they also have that tendency to take and take and take and take, and then maybe one day a pin drops and it's just too much. Yeah,
the question is it 2012 or when will we see it? But I think it's coming. Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Thank you, Plain. Next, we're going to move into the topic of changes in the future. And the next question is from Lua.
Oh, thank you. Hi, Melody. We're going from global revolution now into global earth changes. This is a question from forum member Green Meadow, and she'd like to know what you've seen about earth changes. Some think we are heading into an ice age. Others think we're heading into a time of increased geologic instability with earthquakes and volcanoes. Maybe all of the above, and extreme weather certainly does seem to be on the rise. What can you tell us about what to expect?
My gut feeling is based partly on the snow and other in the wall dream, and also I had another dream a few years ago, not nearly as long ago, but maybe about 6 years ago now, where I was standing in San Francisco, and I used to live in San Francisco, and I was talking, or in the Bay Area, and I was talking to a friend of mine who used to be a member of my circle when I was there. And this young man looked like your stage Hollywood Indian. If you wanted somebody to play, the noble savage, he would be it. He's actually Pomo. And his grandfather actually is a medicine elder. And but anyway, in the dream, he was standing there with his long black hair whipping behind him, dressed in traditionals, and he said, "The great winter is coming. We have to get out of here."
Oh, my. Okay.
Now, at that point, one of my teachers is another Native American elder who helped me learn trance work and a lot of things. And I went to him and I said, I described this dream, and he said, traditionally, the great winter to a Native person would usually mean either the worst winter that an elder himself could remember, say somebody in their 80s or 90s, or that he had heard described to him as a child as the worst thing an elder in their 80s or 90s had seen. So probably the worst winter between 80 and 150 years. He said it could be more than that, but that would be the main traditional view. And he said, and then I waited, and the next year it wasn't bad. I mean, okay. So obviously I have a file in my head that I call interesting, and I just filed the dream in interesting, but it was very, very real. It had what I call the marks of a true dream. A true dream does not necessarily mean that everything in it is going to happen the way you dream it, but it means that the message is there. And one of the marks is this, for me, is this technicolor, very real sense a sense of power, and that, to wake up just shivering or shaking, and that all happened with this. So I put it in interesting for a while. And then things started changing. We got wild weather swings. We had some really hot summers here in Ireland. And then it started gradually getting weirder throughout the world. And then the last 2 years, in the north anyway, have been extremely cold. And my personal view, because if you look at the ice core ratings and things, they're now finding that ice ages are almost always preceded by global warming spikes. That there isn't a one that wasn't. So the two ideas are not mutually exclusive. And I suspect that if we're not actually headed towards a regular ice age, like a full-blown, 20,000 years under the ice thing, I think that we are at least approaching a similar situation to what happened at the end of the Middle Ages, where they have what's called the modern minimum. And the modern minimum is actually brought such horrible weather in the 14th century, just horrible disasters for food and other things, that people thought before the plague came, they thought that God hated them. And then the Black Plague came, partly probably as a result of that climate change. Now, climate change is a really overused word, but historically it really is very important. And like I said, for example, the last 2 years in Ireland, we've had massive snow for here, cold, ice. And we were really expecting that with the Bruin readings, but what we got was massive flooding. And so I think that the violent weather, probably ending on the cold side, at least for the northern hemisphere, is probably going to occur in the next few years. I'm also getting a very strong sense, and have for many years, of eventual earth changes or earthquakes, but the timing is really difficult. I mean, and some things you just don't know. Like I had a dream that the first time I contacted John Hogue was standing in a parking lot in front of Vesuvius, and I have been to Vesuvius, and I have been to Pompeii, and I'm just standing there looking at the mountain, and this young man with very jocular, very kind of fun-loving, looked at me with this kind of smirk on his face, and he said, poor buggers, they didn't have a chance the last time, they won't the next time either. Ha ha ha. Huh. And I mean, I know that was Loki. In my cosmology, yeah. That's Loki. And he was just, Loki isn't necessarily a bad figure, but he's a trickster.
Yeah.
So I mean, and what I told John, obviously we all know we all know Vesuvius is going to explode again, but does this mean it's going to be in my lifetime? I don't know. But it was definitely a true dream. And I was like, okay, I hope they can finish excavating before the next one, and I hope they can get people out of here. Because if you've ever been to Naples, you know that there's like millions of people just packed in this little area, and there'd be no way to get them out if it happened suddenly. Mm-hmm. But again, that's just a dream on interesting, but there's no time on it. And I also have a feeling that the New Madrid, more specifically, I've had a feeling for several years that the New Madrid fault line was waking up, and I think that's starting to be borne out. But again, as to when, don't have timing exactly, but looking at that reading 2013, 2014 in there would not surprise me, at least to have some quakes, and that could be really, really dangerous because they're not, that area, unlike California, that area is not built for earthquakes. There just isn't. Mm-hmm. So anyway, the weather's definitely showing up in runes and in dreams and in cards. And remember, the great winter is coming, or so says a certain Pomo Indian in my dreams.
So basically, what you're saying is all of the above.
Yeah, and probably, I think the whole idea the planet's getting too hot and we're going to all die in a giant pressure. John Hogue and I disagree on this, by the way, but I think that rather than a giant pressure cooker, we're much more likely to freeze. But it could get warmer before it gets colder, but it does seem to actually be, I think the severe winters are going to be an issue for some time.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lua. Next up, we have Uranus rising.
Melodi, you were speaking earlier about your dream and about life back in the 1800s. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about why you see this. And maybe it might be a good idea if you could talk to us about what life might be like, so we might get used to it.
Okay, I wrote this down. I'm going to kind of read it because I had to really think about this one. And I said it's probably a mixture of late 1880s life, basically fairly civilized but without electrical power, with some spots of electricity and other modern things provided locally. Now, that would be different than what you had in the actual 1880s. As someone once said, history doesn't actually repeat, but sometimes it rhymes, and I think that's what's maybe going on here. Life would be much more local, but you wouldn't if it were like the 1880s, you wouldn't be without international contact. But letters would take weeks or months to go across the Atlantic, and goods might take a year to go by sailing ship around the world if there wasn't enough oil to run big modern engines. Again, you might have a few modern ships still going, but they wouldn't be necessarily used for regular trade and transport. Phones would probably exist. They did in the late 1880s, but like electricity, they'd be limited to the very wealthy or the very lucky. A new thing might be radio, might continue, especially shortwave, as would possibly even the internet in places, but by and large, the people you see every day will be your social connections. Travel would be much harder. Trains might exist in some places, but off the main lines. You'd be back the same way Ireland was during World War II. Ireland was effectively thrown back into the 19th century, and people went back to using carts and bicycles and got their buggies out, which hadn't been put away that long, because people just couldn't buy gasoline. So you have films of 1940s Dublin when people, going to in carriage taxis, and I just have a similar thing happen to that in Ireland, which I just said. So that's, I think that gives you sort of a handle. I think it will be a mixture of things. If that's actually what happens, if that's an accurate reading, that would be kind of, I think, what you would find.
Yeah. Well, I'm quite interested in this. And you have a lot of skills as far as old crafts and clothing, textiles. I know you spin and weave. What do you see as being the most important skills that we could relearn, and why you think this would be necessary or helpful? What would be the most important things we should relearn?
Okay, well, I think there are several things, and I think there's what I call first stage and second stage survival tips. And your first stage you can get on a lot of good websites, and they include things like just knowing how to save water in rain barrels, or find water in your local area. Because water you can't live without more than 3 days. So we're going to assume that people already are aware that they probably want to at least have, the classic, some water saved up, some basic food saved up. But long-term skills, what I call second stage preparations or even third stage for long-term, if life goes back to the 1880s or even becomes less comfortable than it is now, say serious Great Depression time.
Right.
I have a list here. Your food production and preservation, this would include gardening, cooking, preserving, hunting, butchering, drying, smoking, canning, making cheese, making bread. Not to scare people, you don't learn all this all at once. And as I tell people, even if you learn to do one or two things and start out, you're going to be way ahead of 99% of the other people. Because to me, the 99% are actually the 99% of people who aren't going to have learned anything. And you're one step ahead the more you get of this list. Okay, then also related to these crafts would be things like making soap, making lye even from ashes, candle making, building fires, etc. Basic herb skills, how to identify them as well as to use them. I fall down here. My husband is actually the herbalist in the family, and he's always teasing me because he said, "Here, you're supposed to be all this witchy stuff, and to you a herb comes in a bottle." He's right. He's right. I mean, he goes out and he grows all this stuff in the garden, and I'm like, "It's a pretty plant."
Yeah.
What is this? But in actuality, in all seriousness, I have learned to identify a few of them, because if he's not there, I won't know I actually planted garlic upside down, which I gather is a fairly common thing to do.